Ever wondered if the creation of Eve wasn't just, about giving Adam a partner, but maybe hinted at something, I don't know, much deeper, something foundational?
Right, like a blueprint for connection itself.
Exactly. Could it even be seen as a kind of original covenant?
That's a fascinating question.
So today we're really diving into the book of Genesis, those cornerstone narratives,
Yep, Genesis 2 especially.
to explore this very idea, the connection between Eve's creation and the whole concept of covenant.
And what that might tell us about marriage, maybe even sacrifice within it.
Yeah, that sacrificial angle is interesting too.
Absolutely. Our goal in this deep dive is, well, to maybe unearth some layers that aren't immediately obvious in these, let's face it, very familiar stories.
Right.
We'll be looking closely at Genesis chapter 2, Eve's creation, and comparing it with that formal covenant ceremony with Abraham in Genesis 15.
Using the source material we've been looking at.
Exactly. We're hoping for those, aha moments for you listening. A fresh angle on text you might think you know inside out.
Okay, so let's start with something that pops up in both stories. This idea of a deep sleep.
Tardema.
Right, that Hebrew word, Tardema. It appears with Adam in Genesis 2 and then again with Abraham in Genesis 15. Same word. But is it the same idea?
Well, that's the thing.
Well,
Linguistically, yes, same word. But theologically, it seems to be doing slightly different work in each place.
How so? With Adam.
Okay, so when Adam falls into this God-induced sleep in Genesis 2, it's the direct prelude to Eve's creation. It's the mechanism, if you like.
God puts him out so he can work.
Pretty much. Adam is completely passive, and it's in that state God takes from his side, forms Eve, and crucially resolves that first declared problem in creation, Adam's aloneness. Remember, it is not good for the man to be alone.
So the sleep facilitates God fixing the not good. It emphasizes God's direct action in forming the relationship.
Exactly. It's very personal, very hands-on, creating someone from Adam to complete Adam in a sense.
Okay, now let's pivot to Genesis 15. Abraham's deep sleep. The setting feels different, more formal.
Very different. If you look at the big picture of God's story with humanity, Abraham's Tardema happens slap bang in the middle of a formal covenant ceremony, a really significant one.
This is where God's making those huge promises, right?
Huge promises. Descendants like the stars, the land, being a blessing to the nations. God is reaffirming and sort of sealing the deal here.
And Abraham's role during the sleep.
Just like Adam, completely passive. He's out cold while the crucial covenant action happens.
That passivity connection is interesting. In both cases, it underlines that God is the primary actor. It's his initiative.
Definitely. But as you said, the purpose feels distinct.
So Adam's sleep is about...
Fundamentally, it's about creating relational unity. It sets up that one flesh partnership we'll get into. It's the divine foundation for marriage, essentially. Okay. Abraham's sleep occurs within this very established symbolic ritual of covenant making. The Abrahamic covenant specifically focused on redemption, nationhood, land, a different scope.
Got it. Okay, let's drill down on that one flesh idea from Adam's story. When Eve is brought to him, he has that famous reaction. This, at last, is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh.
Such a powerful line.
It really is. It sounds so fundamental, like deep recognition. How does that link to the idea of covenant? Is that the covenant moment?
Well, Adam's words there in Genesis 2.23, they definitely signal profound unity, shared being, an intrinsic connection, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. It speaks of an almost indivisible link.
And it leads right into the next verse.
Exactly. Genesis 2.24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That's widely seen as, the foundational statement establishing the essence of marriage, its unity, its permanence.
Okay, so it establishes marriage.
No.
But is establishing this deep one-flesh unity the same thing as enacting a formal covenant, like the ritual we see with Abraham?
And that, I think, is the absolute key distinction we need to make. While Eve's creation and Adam's response undeniably lay the groundwork for what we understand as the covenant of marriage, the committed bond.
Right.
The Genesis 2 narrative itself doesn't actually frame it as a covenant-cutting ritual in the way Genesis 15 does.
How so? What's the difference in the ritual itself?
Well, think about Genesis 15. Abraham prepares animal sacrifices, cuts them in half. Then, while he's asleep, God alone, represented by that smoking fire pot and flaming torch, passes between the pieces.
Yeah, that's a very specific kind of graphic image.
Right.
What did that signify back then?
In the ancient Near East, that was a standard way to ratify a serious treaty or covenant. Walking between the severed animals was like saying, if I break this agreement, may I become like these animals. It was a self-maledictory oath, a solemn guarantee.
Okay, wow.
And the fact that only God passes through in Abraham's story is hugely significant. It highlights the unilateral nature of his promise to Abraham. God's taking all the responsibility, all the potential consequences on himself. Abraham isn't required to do the same in that moment.
And we just don't see any of that kind of ritual, the cut animals, the passing through in the creation of Eve.
Not at all. It's a completely different kind of scene. It's about formation, presentation, recognition, unity, not a formal sacrificial covenant-cutting ceremony.
Okay, that distinction seems clear. Foundational unity for marriage established in Genesis 2, but not the same kind of covenant ritual as Genesis 15. But you mentioned earlier, and the sources hint at, a broader creation covenant. What's that about?
Right. If we zoom out again and look at Genesis 1 and 2 together, many theologians see these chapters as describing a kind of overarching covenant between God and humanity, sometimes called the creation covenant or the covenant of works.
A covenant with Adam and Eve representing all humanity?
Essentially, yes. In this view, they are entrusted with stewardship, with ruling over creation as God's image bearers. That's their side of the arrangement, if you will.
And God's side.
Implied blessings for obedience life, flourishing in the garden, and as becomes clear with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, there are consequences, curses for disobedience,
Yeah.
expulsion, death.
So their relationship, the one flesh thing, isn't just about them. It's tied into this larger job they have.
Exactly. And this helps us understand Eve's role as Adam's helper, described in Genesis 2.18. It's not about being a subordinate assistant.
Not just bringing him his slippers.
Definitely not. The Hebrew word, Ezra, is often used for God himself providing help. It suggests a vital partner, someone who corresponds to him, is essential for fulfilling their shared mandate to care for and govern creation together. So, the deep sleep, the creation of Eve from Adam's side, it all reinforces humanity's original calling within this creation covenant framework, reflecting God's loving rule. And that focus is, again, distinct from the Abrahamic covenant's later emphasis on redemption and forming a specific people.
This adds another layer entirely. So Eve's creation isn't a covenant-cutting ritual, but it happens within this broader creation covenant context, and it establishes the partnership needed to fulfill that covenant.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, now let's circle back to that idea of marriage in a sacrificial setting. If Eve's creation wasn't a literal sacrifice like cutting animals, how does sacrifice fit in?
This is where we need to think more thematically, perhaps metaphorically, rather than strictly ritualistically.
Okay.
While there's no literal animal sacrifice, the act itself, God taking from Adam's own body, his side, to form Eve, is incredibly profound. It establishes their interconnectedness at the deepest possible level. They're literally, originally of one substance.
It's a connection formed by taking something from Adam.
Right. And you could, perhaps, interpret the cost to Adam. The induced vulnerability of the deep sleep, the giving up of a part of himself, as symbolically pointing towards a kind of deep commitment and self-giving inherent in the marriage bond.
So not a ritual sacrifice, but maybe a foundational act of giving, a sort of symbolic cost that points to the nature of the relationship being formed.
Exactly. It's not about appeasement or atonement like later sacrifices, but it does hint at that element of yielding something of oneself for the sake of the union.
And how does that connect to the one flesh idea?
Well, that one flesh unity, established right there at the beginning, really sets the pattern. It suggests marriage is fundamentally about mutual giving, about prioritizing the union, sometimes involving, yes, self-sacrifice for the good of the other and the relationship. Two, becoming one involves a kind of merging, a deep intertwining of lives and interests. So even without the formal covenant-cutting ritual, the creation narrative powerfully models marriage as this incredibly deep, committed, unified relationship. It resonates with those core covenantal themes of faithfulness, commitment, and unity, even if the form is different from Abraham's experience. It lays down a pattern of unity through divine action and inherent giving.
That makes sense. It's like the foundation stone for understanding relational covenant, even if it's not the finished building.
Precisely. It establishes the nature of the bond.
Okay, this has been really insightful. Let's try and crystallize the main points for everyone listening. What are the key takeaways here?
Sure. I think first it's really important to see that Eve's creation establishes the foundation of marriage as this profound symbolic unity, this shared being. But it's not presented as a formal covenant-cutting ceremony like Abraham's in Genesis 15. that distinction matters.
Right, different kinds of divine acts.
Second, that deep sleep, the Tardema, is key in both stories. It highlights God's initiative, his direct action, but for different ends. Relational unity for Adam and Eve, formal covenant promises for Abraham.
Got it.
Third, we need to see Adam and Eve's story within the larger context of that Genesis 1 and 2 creation covenant. Their union is part of humanity's original calling to partner with God in caring for creation.
Okay, makes sense. And finally,
While it's not a literal sacrifice, the way Eve is formed from Adam, that taking from his side powerfully illustrates the deep commitment, the inherent giving, and the one-flesh unity at the heart of marriage. It echoes those core covenantal values of faithfulness and self-giving, even without the specific ritual elements.
so it sets a pattern.
It really does. It lays a foundation for understanding relationships, especially marriage, in terms of deep, God-ordained unity and commitment.
Okay, so thinking about all this, the deep sleep, the one flesh unity, the creation covenant backdrop, the symbolic giving, here's something maybe for you to ponder. Considering this deep dive, how might understanding these ancient connections, this foundational picture of unity and commitment in Genesis, how might that reshape your perspective on the meaning and significance of your own relationships and commitments today?
That's a great question to leave people with.
It definitely invites some reflection, doesn't it? We really encourage you to maybe revisit Genesis 1 and 2, think about these parallels and distinctions we've discussed, and consider what they mean for how you view connection and commitment.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.